Kansas Territory, 1872. The wind was dry and sharp the morning they dragged Grace Penner into the dusty center of Dry Creek and put her on a wooden crate like a sack of grain. The price on her head, $5 flat. She had not cried, not at the jailhouse last night when they caught her running barefoot with her skirts soaked in river water, and not now, under the harsh eye of the sheriff. Her hands were tied in front of her, wrists red and raw. She kept her chin high, even as the men in the crowd laughed and spit tobacco too close to her boots. "Runaway girl," someone shouted. "Probably not worth the $5, I'll take her for $4. Another barked. "She ain't a mule, Jed," the sheriff said, but even he grinned a little. $5. "That's the price. One of you want her or not?" Grace scanned the faces. All of them were strangers except the man who had betrayed her, Tommy Dillard, the ranch hand who promised he would help her get to Nebraska, then turned her over for the bounty. Her chest burned when she looked at him. He did not meet her eyes. Then someone new stepped forward. He was tall, coat dusty from the trail, wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. His boots were scuffed at the toes, and he had a rifle slung over one shoulder. He looked like he had not slept in days. But his eyes were steady, serious, and fixed on her. "I'll pay the $5, the man said quietly, pulling coins from his saddlebag. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You sure? She's a runaway and a thief." "I'm sure," he said, dropping the coins into the sheriff's palm without blinking. "Let her down." The sheriff grunted, then nodded to the deputies. They untied her wrists, and the moment her boots hit the dirt, Grace stumbled forward. The stranger caught her elbow before she fell. "Easy," he muttered. She looked up at him, really looked this time. He was young, maybe late 20s, with sun-worn skin and a scar near his jaw. His voice was low and kind. "Why?" she asked. He glanced around at the crowd, then back at her. "Because $5 is a cheap price for a woman's life." They walked away from the town together, neither speaking for a while. Horses shifted in the hitching posts behind them, and the wind lifted the hem of Grace's dress. "You got a name?" he asked once they were far enough out of earshot. "Grace," she said. "Grace Penner." He nodded once. "Colt Dawson," she studied him. "You just passing through?" "No," he said. "Looking for work, maybe a place to breathe." Grace licked her lips. "You just bought yourself a whole mess of trouble, Colt Dawson." He gave a small shrug. "Maybe. But I reckon I can live with that." They rode double on his horse for most of the day, and when they stopped to make camp by a creek, he gave her the blanket from his saddle roll and built the fire while she shivered beside it. He did not ask questions. He did not touch her. That night she watched him from the other side of the firelight. He had a quiet way about him, like he had known hardship but never let it hollow him out. His hands were rough but steady. He moved like he'd been on his own for a long time. Grace had not trusted anyone in a long time. But something in her softened just a little when she saw him sleep with his hat over his eyes, knife within reach, like he was ready to protect something even in his dreams. The next morning, she told him the truth. "I was sold when I was 15, she said, voice barely more than a whisper over the sound of the stream. "To a man twice my age. He died last spring and his brother tried to keep me, said I was still property, so I ran." Colt did not flinch. "You are not property," she nodded, but her eyes were wet. "They said I was. They were wrong." They rode west toward Abilene. Colt said he knew a place where she could find work, maybe start fresh. Grace did not ask what he was running from, but she guessed men like him did not wander unless they had something to leave behind. On the evening of the third day, a sudden storm forced them to shelter in an old abandoned cabin. The roof leaked in places and the shutters creaked in the wind, but it was dry enough. Colt built a fire fast and warm, and Grace helped him unpack the horse. As she spread out the blankets, she caught him watching her. "What?" she asked. He looked away, but not fast enough. "Nothing, just—" "You are brave," she blinked. "I am tired, I am dirty, I have nothing but this dress and a name." "And still," he said, "you stood tall on that crate like you were not afraid of any of them." She sat down beside the hearth and leaned back against the logs. "I was terrified." "I know," he said. "That is what made it brave." Their eyes held for a second too long. Grace felt something shift in her chest. That night the rain beat heavy on the roof. Grace could not sleep. She turned over once, then again, and saw him lying closer than he had the nights before. His hand rested near hers. "Colt," she whispered. "Yeah, thank you." He opened his eyes. "You do not owe me anything, Grace." She scooted closer, her voice soft. "I know, that is why it matters." He did not move as she reached out and touched his wrist. His skin was warm. "I have not felt safe in a long time," she breathed. He looked down at their hands. "I want you to." And just like that, something gentle bloomed between them, not rushed, not forced, just real. The next morning they headed west again. Grace rode beside him now, her back straighter, her gaze brighter. She was still quiet, still cautious, but something in her had begun to hope. Colt glanced at her while the sun rose behind them. "You ever been to Colorado?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "No." "Let's go then," he said. "New places feel better with someone beside you." She looked at him long and true. "I would like that." And for the first time in years, Grace Penner believed she might get to choose what came next. The trail out of Kansas grew quieter 2 days past Ellsworth, where the last of the rail lines gave way to open grassland and wind-shaped cottonwoods. Colt led them along lesser-used roads, where wagon ruts had faded and the ground held the hush of places long passed over. His horse, a bay gelding named Hob, moved with steady patience, and Grace had begun to ride on her own colt, had traded a silver watch for a second saddle and a roan mare from a weathered German farmer outside Wilson. Grace rode light, her back straight, hands firm on the reins. She didn't speak much during the day, but her eyes wandered studying hawks overhead, the lines of distant hills, the way clouds broke apart like pulled wool. Colt watched her more than he should have, not with hunger but with a quiet wondering, like she was a song he hadn't heard the end of yet. They stopped near Smoky Hill River that evening, where a few cottonwoods still held their leaves despite the season's slow turn. Grace gathered kindling while Colt cleaned the trout he'd caught with a loop of line and a tin hook. She knelt by the fire pit, arranging twigs with careful hands, sleeves rolled to her elbows. "You fish much?" she asked without looking up. "Only when there's no jerky left," Colt replied. "You?" She gave a small shrug. "My brother used to. I watched mostly. He said I scared the fish off by talking too much. You don't talk much now, I guess I learned." He didn't answer right away. The knife hissed through the trout's belly. "How old was he?" Colt asked quietly. 17 when the fever came." Her voice didn't falter. "Our mother followed him 3 weeks later. I was 13. Colt rinsed the fish in the river, then brought it to the fire without a word. They cooked it over the coals, the smell clean and earthy. When they ate, they used their fingers and didn't speak. The quiet between them had softened into something companionable. Later, when the stars were out and the fire had dropped to embers, Grace sat with her knees pulled to her chest, blanket over her shoulders. Colt sat nearby, oiling the rifle that had seen him through 2 states and 1 border skirmish. "You said you weren't just passing through," she said, her voice low. "What were you hoping to find out here?" He didn't look up. "A stretch of land, somewhere I can build something with my own hands. My father worked another man's ranch till the day he died. I aim not to die that way. Land's not easy to come by. I know, figured I'd find some broken place and mend it up." Grace looked over at him, firelight catching the edge of her cheek. "You ever have anyone to build it with?" His hands paused just a second. "Not yet." The night held quiet again. The river whispered nearby. "I want something of my own too," she said after a moment. "Not just safety, not just to be left alone. I want to matter somewhere." "You do," he said without hesitation. He didn't say it like it needed proving, just like it was already true. They slept close that night, not touching, but near enough that when the cold crept in before dawn, she tucked her hands beneath the edge of his coat without asking, and he didn't pull away. By the end of the week, they'd crossed into eastern Colorado. The land was rougher here, scrubby brush, ridges that turned suddenly steep. They passed few people. Once a group of Ute riders watched them from a rise, then turned and rode off without a word. Grace's hand tightened on her reins, but Colt kept steady. "I'm not used to being seen and left alone," she said after they were out of sight. "Not every look means harm. No, but enough have." They camped that night near an old stageway station, long since abandoned. Only the stone chimney remained and a rusted hinge where a door used to hang. Grace found a tin cup inside the hearth, blackened with age. She held it like it was a relic. "I'd like to live in a place with a real door," she said. "We'll find one," Colt answered, "or build it." She glanced over. "You keep saying we. I mean it." Grace didn't smile, but her jaw loosened, her shoulders less rigid. The next day brought wind. Dust kicked up in spirals, and both horses rode with their heads low. They found shelter in a rocky outcropping by midday. Colt led them into the narrow shadow of it, and Grace dismounted with a wince. Her thighs ached from the saddle, but she didn't complain. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm not made of glass." "I didn't say you were." She stretched her arms overhead, ribs rising beneath her bodice. "You ever think about what you'd be if you weren't riding west with a stranger and a gun?" He thought a moment. "Maybe a blacksmith. I like working with my hands, figuring out what needs shaping." She nodded. "I might have kept bees. My mother did back when we lived near the river." "I was never stung once." "Bees know things," he said. She gave him a puzzled look. "They can tell when someone's good to them." That night she fell asleep before the fire burned down. Colt watched her from where he sat, back against a rock, rifle across his lap. The moon was high, silvering the edges of her hair. She'd kicked off one boot, and her hand curled near her face like a child's. He didn't try to name what he was feeling. He just let it settle in his chest, quiet and strong like the first breath of spring after a long, hard freeze. By the time they reached the edge of Fremont County, the mountains had begun to rise in the west like blue smoke. The air thinned, carrying that dry, pine-bitten scent that spoke of colder nights and cleaner skies. Colt guided them along the Arkansas River, where the scrub gave way to taller grass and the ground grew rockier. Grace rode her mare with an ease that hadn't been there a week ago, her hands firm and her gaze forward. They passed a burned-out homestead late in the afternoon, a stone foundation, some charred timbers, and a rusted kettle half buried in the soot. Grace slowed her horse without meaning to. Colt drew up beside her. "Raid?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "Could have been a lightning fire. Or a stove left burning." She studied the ruins a moment longer. "Someone tried to start something here," he nodded. "Some places don't take root easy." They rode on without speaking. That night they camped near a grove of junipers. The trees bent eastward from years of wind, and the soil beneath them held the scent of crushed needles. Colt laid out the bedrolls while Grace sorted through the last of their lentils. She scraped enough into the pot for a thin stew, then sat on her heels and watched the fire catch. "You ever come this way before?" she asked. "Once," he said. "Worked a calving run near Canyon City, didn't stay long. You leave every place that quick, only the ones that didn't want me." She stirred the pot with a twig. "And if this place don't want us either, we'll keep riding." She gave a quiet laugh, more breath than sound. "You make it sound simple." "It ain't," he said, "but it's ours to choose." After they ate, Grace pulled out the beaten journal she'd kept pressed into the bottom of her saddlebag. The corners were bent, the spine soft with use. She didn't write in it, hadn't in years, but she opened it anyway and ran her fingers over the pages. "What's in there?" Colt asked. "Things I thought I'd forget," she said. "Turns out I remember them anyway." He leaned back on his elbows, watching the stars blink through the branches. "You ever think about writing new pages?" Grace traced a faded line with her thumb. "Wouldn't know where to start. Maybe with now." She looked up from the journal. "And what would I write about you, you tell me?" She studied him for a long moment. "You don't talk about the war." Colt's jaw shifted, but he didn't look away. "Not much to say. You fought?" "I was 17 when they conscripted me. Didn't know how to hold a rifle proper." "Union," he nodded. "You come home?" she asked. "I came back," he said, "but I wouldn't call it home." Grace closed the journal. "I think I understand that." They didn't speak again until the fire had burned down. Grace lay beneath her blanket, eyes open, listening to the wind move through the trees. Colt sat upright, sharpening the edge of a small blade with long, even strokes. "You're always ready for something," she said. "It's a habit," he replied. "Learned early that sleep don't always mean safe." She rolled to face him. "Do you ever rest?" He stopped sharpening. "I don't know." She reached for the blanket between them, lifted it gently. "You could try." Colt looked at her, long and steady. He slipped beneath the edge of it, careful not to touch her at first. It was enough just being near. Grace exhaled, slow and quiet, and the space between them filled with the warmth of shared breath and the hush of something beginning. In the morning, frost had kissed the grass, and their boots left clear prints as they packed up camp. They rode in silence until the sun crested the ridge and lit the world gold. Ahead lay the promise of land that hadn't yet been claimed, where the soil waited for hands that knew loss and still chose to build. Colt pointed toward a low valley cupped between hills, where a line of cottonwoods followed a shallow stream. "There," he said. "That looks like a place a door might stand." Grace followed his gaze. "And bees might come," he smiled, slow and quiet. "You remember." "I remember everything," she said, "especially what's mine." They rode on, side by side, toward the place they hadn't known they were looking for. The valley they'd seen from the ridge opened wide beneath the late autumn sun, the grass long and gold and swaying like it remembered the wind from 100 years back. A line of cottonwoods followed the bend of the stream, their trunks pale and flaking where elk had rubbed the bark. The place didn't look like much not yet, but it held stillness, the kind that waited. Colt dismounted first and walked the length of the creek bank while Grace held the horses. He knelt once, dug his fingers into the soil, turned it over in his palm. When he looked up, she was watching him. "Well," she asked. "Dark earth, no rock near the top," he said. "Could hold roots." She slid from her saddle without waiting for help. "What about water through the winter?" Streams fed from the hills. "Might shift come spring melt, but it won't dry out." Grace looked around at the trees, the slope of the land, the way the creek curved like a cradle. "You'd stay here." "I think I would." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the edge of the stream and crouched. Her hand hovered just above the water, fingers trailing the air. "It's quiet," she said. "But not empty." Colt nodded. "That's what I heard too." They made camp that night beside the stream, not far from a cluster of boulders warm from the day's sun. Grace gathered dried grass and bits of bark from a fallen tree, while Colt stacked stones into a fire ring and cleared the brush. By the time dusk came, the flames were steady and low, and the scent of char and juniper hung in the air. She sat cross-legged, sleeves rolled, her hands brushing ash from her skirt. "You ever build a cabin?" "No," Colt said. "But I've cut logs and laid a roof. Helped raise a barn once back east of the Flint Hills." Grace tilted her head. "You think two people can do it, if the hands are willing." She looked down at her palms, calloused now, a small cut healing near her thumb. "Mine are." Colt shifted, resting his forearm across one knee. "We'd need an axe, saw, nails. Maybe canvas for the roof until we can get shingles up." "There's a trading post west of here," she said. "A few riders passed us 2 days back had sacks of flour and saddle oil. Might mean there's a supplier not far." He nodded. "We'll ride out tomorrow. Get what we can carry." Grace was quiet a long while after that, gaze lost in the fire. Then she said, "When I was a child, I used to think I'd end up in a house someone else built, that I'd just step into it like it was waiting." Colt didn't interrupt. "But I think I'd rather know every nail, every board," she continued. "Even if it's crooked, even if the floor creaks." He smiled faintly. "Then we'll build you a crooked floor." Later, as the fire faded to coals, Colt lay on one side of the bedrolls, watching the stars blink through the bare branches overhead. Grace lay beside him, the side of her hip just touching his. She didn't pull away. "You miss anything from before?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Sometimes I miss the sound of my mother's voice, not words, just the sound of her moving through the kitchen, humming while she worked." Grace's voice was soft. "I miss the smell of beeswax." My mother used to polish the windowsills with it, said the scent kept her feeling clean even when everything else was a mess. Colt turned his head. We can find beeswax. Grace turned too, her face close to his now, eyes open to the dark. You always say that. That we can find what's missing. That's because I believe it. She searched his face and something in her settled. She reached across the space between them not far now and took his wrist, her thumb brushing the inside where the skin was warm and thin. I didn't expect you, she whispered. I wasn't looking for anyone. And now, he didn't hesitate. Now I want to build a home with you in it. Grace drew in a breath, not sharp but deep, like something long held had finally loosened. She leaned forward, slow and sure, and let her lips meet his. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't uncertain. It was a promise, low and quiet as the wind in the grass. When morning came, they rose early. Colt saddled the horses while Grace packed the bags with what they'd need for the ride west. She folded the blanket he'd given her that first night, the one he hadn't asked back. It smelled of wood smoke and river stone. Before they mounted up, she turned to him. When we come back, she said, we start. Colt nodded. We start. And together they rode toward the day, toward the place that waited to be made whole by their hands. The trading post sat low beneath the shoulder of the mountains, its wood plank siding dulled to gray by wind and time. It wasn't more than a dozen buildings clustered around a wide dirt square storehouse, smithy, 2 dwellings, and a livery, but the sight of it after 3 days on the trail brought a quiet ease to Grace's shoulders. She adjusted her seat as they rode in, eyes on the smoke curling from a stovepipe behind the store. Colt slowed his horse. We'll need to trade for the saw and nails before anything else. Grace adjusted the strap on her saddlebag. I'll look for canvas and a kettle. We'll need one that holds heat. She moved with quiet purpose inside the store, sorting through bolts of cloth and stacked tins while Colt haggled with a man whose shirt was missing 2 buttons and whose temper frayed quick at the edges. Grace didn't interrupt. Colt had a way of getting what they needed without letting anyone see how hard he worked for it. By noon, they had the tools wrapped and tied behind the saddle, 2 sacks of flour, a small iron pot, and a coil of rope. Colt handed her a wrapped bundle of dried apples as they mounted up again. I saw you eyeing them, he said. She took it without smiling, but her fingers lingered on his. You notice everything? Only the things that matter. They rode back slower, the horses weighted heavy. Grace didn't complain, though her legs ached by the second night. Colt pointed out a path between 2 stone ridges that would cut half a day's ride, and they made camp beside a fallen pine, the bark stripped clean by deer. She sat beside him while he carved notches into a length of ash wood, measuring for the beams they'd cut once they returned. His knife moved careful and sure, each stroke deliberate. You ever think about what kind of door you'll want? She asked. He didn't look up. One that stays shut in winter. One that don't swing open in a storm. She shifted closer. I meant the kind folks remember, the one you paint or carve something into, something that tells a little about who lives behind it. Colt paused. Never thought about that. Grace ran her fingers along the edge of the pot they'd bought. I think I'd like something carved, not letters, just a shape, maybe a tree or a bee. He looked over. A bee, she met his eyes. They find what they need, they work, they stay. Colt set down the wood. Then a bee it is. The next morning, the frost clung thicker to the grass and the horse's breath came in plumes. They reached the valley before dusk, the sun tipping low behind the hills, turning the creek to silver. Grace dismounted without waiting. She walked the edge of the flat ground beside the cottonwoods, then stopped. Here, she said, kneeling to touch the earth. This is where the door should face, toward the water. Colt unpacked the saw, his sleeves pushed to the elbows. We'll start with the frame. Then get the roof up before snow. They worked steady through the next 2 weeks, rising with the sun and setting tools aside only when light failed. Colt cut the logs with the rhythm of someone who understood weight and balance, his shoulders straining, shirt damp from the effort. Grace hauled stone for the hearth and stacked it with a mason's care, her hands blistered, her jaw tight with focus. She never asked for rest. He never offered more than she could carry. They built slow but sure 2 walls by the end of the first week, a roof frame set by the next. Grace learned the sound of each tool, the creak of green wood, the way Colt's breath hitched when he lifted anything too long without stopping. They shared bread and lentils at dusk, sometimes an apple between them if the day had gone well. Grace told him once about the shape of her brother's laugh, how it used to echo in the rafters when he climbed too high in the barn loft. Colt told her about a creek in Tennessee where the trout ran thick every spring, and how his mother used to send him barefoot to catch them with his hands. One night, after the door was hung and the roof canvas nailed tight, they sat inside for the first time, backs against the wall, wind hissing outside. Grace rubbed her palm over the edge of the hearthstone. "It's real now." Colt leaned his head back. "It's home." She looked over, her face quiet, eyes dark in the firelight. "I didn't think I'd ever belong to anything again." "You don't," he said, her brow furrowed. "You belong with someone," he added. "That's different." She let the silence settle between them, then reached out and took his hand. Her fingers threaded through his, rough skin to rough skin, and she leaned her head onto his shoulder with a breath that trembled just once before it stilled. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. By the time the first snow dusted the ground, the chimney was up, and the shutters held fast. Grace packed dried herbs into linen she'd gathered from a trapper's wife in exchange for mending a shirt. Colt carved the bee into the door with a pocket knife, its wings outstretched, just above the latch. He called her outside to see it, his hands still dusted with wood shavings. She traced the lines without speaking. Then she turned and kissed him, slow, deliberate, the kind of kiss that claimed nothing but offered everything. They stood like that as the snow fell, hand in hand, breath rising between them. Years passed. The house held firm through storm and thaw. Grace planted lavender near the creek, and by the 3rd spring, bees came. Colt built a bench beside the hearth where she read old paperbacks brought in by passing riders. He kept his rifle hung above the door, but he rarely needed it. One summer, a child came into their life, a boy left by his dying mother, bundled tight and silent. Grace lifted him without question. Colt wrapped him in a wool blanket and fed him warm milk from a tin cup. They never sent him away. They named him Elias. By the time he walked, he'd carved his own mark beside the bee on the door, just a crooked line, but Grace kept it there. Colt taught him to fish with a line and hook. Grace showed him how to find honey without getting stung. At night, the 3 of them sat on the bench by the fire, Colt's arm around Grace's shoulders, Elias curled at their feet, and the wind outside never sounded like loneliness again. The house stood. The door stayed shut when it needed to. And inside they loved each other well.